All right, I've hit the record button. Um, let's see here. Are you, let's see. Oh goodness. What are you seeing? Are we still seeing Ray?
Just your little box.
Oh, here we
You
go.
haven't. There you go. Share your
How about
screen.
now? All right. Are you seeing Metaphysics and Integrity, Reframing Jewish Ethical Monotheism?
Yes.
All right. Let two gentlemen in. Okay. And you're not seeing a next slide, no notes, nothing like that?
Nope.
All right,
Just
great.
your just your introductory slide.
Very well then, let's get started. Hello there, I'm Paul Miles with the International Society for Biblical Hermeneutics, and this is a presentation as part of our series on Israel in the Church. I am entitling this presentation Metaphysics and Integrity, Reframing Jewish Ethical Monotheism with a Dispensational Framework. So we got a lot to cover, so let's jump right in. So, in the discussion of developing a worldview, there are two basic questions that we could frame. First is the way things are and the way things ought to be. Now, the logical procession for developing a worldview would be to start with the way that things are, and from there, decide the way things ought to be. It would be logical to build a worldview from the bottom up in this way. However, the social pressure is always from the top down. We often start with discussions about the way things ought to be, and we allow that to dictate the way that things are. There's something of a classic model in evangelical circles, often referred to as the four-layered cake model, which divides that up so that the way things are can be described in terms of epistemology, which is the philosophy of knowledge and understanding, and metaphysics, which is the philosophy and discussion of the nature of reality. Whereas the way things ought to be side of the discussion can be expressed in terms of ethics, what's right and wrong, and politics, which is how to govern a society. This model itself is in need of perhaps some improvement. For one thing, aesthetics is an important part of a worldview, and it's not quite present in the model. Also, there have been increasing discussions, especially in the 20th century, over how epistemology and metaphysics are inherently related and informing each other. But still, for um, uh, all that it is, we can consider this to be sort of a simplified model for components of a worldview. Today, we are going to talk about a relationship between ontology and ethics. Ontology is the philosophy that deals with the nature of being, and we are going to discuss how our understanding of ontology and what exists and what doesn't exist and the nature of existence, how that informs ethics. So this will be discussed in three parts. First, we'll have a discussion on ethical monotheism. Ethical monotheism is a concept that has developed in intellectual discussions among Jews, especially in the 20th century. So some Jewish thinkers have come up with an interesting model called ethical monotheism. We'll talk about what that is. Then we'll look at some alternatives to ethical monotheism. And then I would like to propose an ethical dispensationalism, how we can use dispensationalism as a framework that could be informing our ethical structures and frameworks. Okay, so first things first, what is ethical monotheism? I suppose we could start this discussion by looking at an interesting phenomenon that occurs in ancient Near Eastern literature. I'm speaking of the Code of Hammurabi. Now, the Code of Hammurabi has these two lines right here. If a man has caused the loss of a gentleman's eye, his eye one shall cause to be lost. If he has shattered a gentleman's limb, one shall shatter his limb. Saying that if you break another man's leg or poke his eyeball out, then you should have your eyeball poked out. Um, now, uh, it's interesting because people will often take this little snippet out of context and then they'll take another Bible verse out of context and say, see, the Bible is copying from the Code of Hammurabi or other ancient Near Eastern literature. But there are some real differences between what we see here and what we see prescribed in the Bible. For example, if we go a few lines down, we see this. If he has caused the son of the owner of the house to die, one shall put to death the son of that builder. Okay, so if you build a house, it collapses, it kills the son of the owner, then your son will die. So in the still of Hammurabi, we're not seeing a real justice being taken place, right? If you cause a kid to die, your kid dies instead of you dying. So this is seemingly a conflict with what we saw earlier, that if you poke out one man's eye, that your eye will be poked out as well. I say seemingly contradiction because there is a metaphysical basis for all of this. What we're seeing in the ethical code is not an equality of humans on the basis that all humans are created in the image of God, which is what we would see in the Bible. Rather, it presupposes an ontology of an evolutionary cosmic struggle. The gods are in conflict and trying to fight to become the top dog. So we humans should look at each other as ranking in ontological value. I am more valuable than your son. I am more valuable than my son. So if I cost you your son, you can take out my son, is the logic here. What do we see in the Bible? We see something else, right? In the Bible, we see eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise, right? The idea being, if I knock your tooth out, then you would knock out my tooth. If I knock out your son's tooth, then you knock out my tooth, not my son's tooth. My son did nothing wrong, is the notion. Now this comes out of Exodus 21. The text here is 22 through 27. And it's interesting. The context here actually gives the basis for a lot of true justice ideas. It's based on the idea of man being ontologically equal to each other. Earlier in the chapter, we see some text which provides for bondservants to be taken in, and we see actually God constructing a process for the bondservants to be protected from abuse. It's often misinterpreted to say quite to the contrary. But what we're seeing in the biblical account is an ethical code, a social political code that presupposes that God is the ultimate good. He's the one writing the law. And so we have a objective standard of morality. Okay, so those are the text. Let's take a look at what ethical monotheists are saying about ethical monotheism. Dennis Prager is probably the most popular voice among evangelicals, perhaps, for a lot of this thought. He defines it as such. Ethical monotheism means that the one God, that's monotheism, is the source of ethics, of morality. Morality, an objective code of right and wrong, does not emanate from human opinion. It emanates from God and therefore transcends human opinion. In other words, there is one God, he is good, he says what is right and wrong, and that is the absolute truth of the matter. Now, he's not the first to explore the idea. The first philosopher to start codifying this was probably Hermann Cohen, who lived in the 19th and early 20th centuries. First, he talks about Aristotle and Plato as kind of his models for comparison. He shows that Aristotle could not derive an adequate basis for ethics from nature itself. Being as how Aristotle was a pagan, he did not have an absolute God who had an absolute text that he could go to, so he kind of went to nature around him. And that turned up somewhat void. He also makes an interesting statement about Philo, the ancient Alexandrian Jewish author. He says it was not only Christianity that emerged in terms of speculation out of pantheism, in particular out of the Philonic doctrines, speaking of Philo of Alexandria, finding its ever-recurring impetus for rejuvenation in this kind of speculation. Even Judaism could not and would not altogether resist the temptation of pantheism's sweet poison. Philo lacks independent stature in his speculations, having been nurtured by the overwhelming power of Hellenic thinking and therefore has no intimate effect on Jewish apologetics. So he is criticizing Philo here, and we'll return to Philo here in a bit, for being kind of a middleman, if you will, between ethical monotheism and a syncretism with paganistic ideology. Leo Back is a Reformed Jew with liberal tendencies. His statements about the origins of ethical monotheism are problematic, but he makes some comments that are worth hearing out. He speaks of only in Israel did an ethical monotheism exist, and wherever else it is found later on, it has been derived directly or indirectly from Israel. And he relates this to the election of Israel, that Israel was to be a light to the nations, and ethical monotheism, I think in Bayek's view, would be the primary idea. I would take a slightly different view that ethical monotheism, to the extent that it is meritorious and correct, was indeed an aspect that Israel would show to the world.
Hey.
Please mute your microphones if you have not already. Is my microphone working? Are you hearing me? Is it working? Let's see.
All good.
All good? Okay, great. All right. So a summary of monotheism is as follows. There is one God. He is all good. His law is based on an ethics that affirms absolutes. And without one God who is good, ethics and social political thought will become subjective. That's the basic notion of ethical monotheism. So that's what that is. Now let's take a look at some alternatives. First of all, we can look at a couple of biblical statements about the ontological basis of the ethical monotheism. We see that the Bible affirms a distinction between the creator and the creation. Everything that is created exists as distinct from the creator, because we see in the creation narrative that the creator is speaking things into existence ex nihilo. The creator is pre-existent. He does not take bits from himself to create anything. We also see that God is triune, and that the three persons in one God are in complete harmony and cooperation throughout the creation narrative. That's the biblical account. Now let's take a look at some alternatives. Specifically, we will consider some of the creation accounts from ancient Egypt. So here is one text that has a couple of sources to it. In this creation text, we have the following. Atum, who is a primordial Egyptian god, is the one who came into being as one, who came to erection in Heliopolis. He put his penis in his fist so that to make orgasm with it, and the two twins, Shu and Tefnut, were born. So in this creation account, we have the primordial god creating Shu and Tefnut, the gods of the atmosphere and moisture, through an act of cosmic masturbation, taking something from one god and making more gods out of it. Fortunately, there are other more G-rated versions of this, being as how the Egyptians were not inspired by God. They have contradictions in their creation accounts. But here's one that says that Atum became high as the ground, rose in Heliopolis again. This time he sneezed Shu and spat Tefnut. So the two snippets here that we see the continuity of being are in the statement Ishish nek mshu, you sneezed Shu, and Tefn mkat Tefnut, you spat Tefnut. So in this worldview, the gods are spit and boogers. Then, of course, Shu and Tefnut, the gods that are the atmosphere and the moisture, they breed and give birth to Geb, the god of earth, and Nut, the goddess of the sky, who is being held up by Shu, the god of the atmosphere. This is the Greenfield Papyrus. We see all sorts of paganism, hay deities all around. So Geb, the earth, and Nut, the sky, they go on to have two children, or several children, two of which are Osiris and Set. Osiris was originally affiliated with life and fertility, and then he became affiliated with death and resurrection because of a drama that he had with his brother Set, who was affiliated with disorder, storms, and violence. Now, Set is an altogether rather violent guy. He is full of chaos and disorder, but he's not necessarily got any bearing of what's right and wrong. For example, here he is spearing Apep, which is a snake, another chaos deity. At any rate, in the Osiris myth, Set goes after his brother Osiris, kills him, and then scatters his body parts all over the place as a cosmic battle between order and chaos. So other gods have to arise to the occasion. One that rises to the occasion is Set and Osiris's sister Isis, whom we see in this depiction here. It's a little blurry, what with all the deterioration that's occurred. She appears as a bird to have sex with her brother Osiris in order to give birth to Horus, who is present here even though he hasn't been born yet. And that is Isis as a person next to him, even though that she's a bird at the same time. The logic here is it's mystical, so it doesn't actually have to make a whole lot of sense. But we see as a result of the breeding between two gods, we get another god, Horus, who then goes on a mission to kill Set, who is now depicted as a hippopotamus in the temple of Edfu. And then they reassemble all of Osiris's body parts and they put him back together, and that's how he becomes the god of resurrection and the other afterlife. Of course, we see the Osiris myth having influences in every aspect of Egyptian life. Horus eventually becomes the incarnate in Pharaoh, so that Pharaoh is now Horus, even if we have like a co-regency thing, in which case we have multiple Horuses happening at once, and that's not problematic because it's paganism. For the Egyptians, it was a really big deal if you could unify northern and southern Egypt. By doing that, you are committing a grand act of theological significance because you're uniting the lands where Osiris's body has been scattered. This is a depiction of that in the Egyptian statue of Darius from Susa. Darius is a biblical person. Susa is a biblical location, so I bring this particular artifact in, but the significance of Hapi and the reunification of the lands goes way back further from the Achaemenid period. But I like biblical figures, so we put him in the slide instead. That's the political realm that is influenced in many ways by the paganistic ontology, but it also goes into other aspects of the religious practices. So here is the sarcophagus of Ankhenesefebere, who is a priestess and a princess. Of course, she is completely sexualized in her sarcophagus. On the text, though, you can see these interesting bits. We have this title, which is ascribed to the priestess, Hemet Necher, which is God's wife. The idea being that the priestess has a particular duty to carry on the deity through a husband and wife and breeding sort of arrangement. We also have this title, which is ascribed to the queen. It is Deret Necher, which is God's hand, which is likely a reference back to the cosmic masturbation creation narratives that we saw, with the idea that the Pharaoh, who is God, his wife is supposed to simulate him in a similar manner to keep the gods coming. And of course, the gods are going to constantly be in conflict. Every time that you see the Pharaoh doing something weird, that is a god that is doing something weird. So we see something interesting here in the coffin of Itineb, which is not a pharaoh or anything, but we can see certain soteriological and eschatological elements of the Egyptian mythology depicted. So in this section, we see the goddess Newt with a sun disk on her head. Thankfully, she's at least partially dressed this morning. And below that, we have a heart weighing ceremony where Itanib has his heart weighed. That's what we see here. The heart weighing ceremony consisted of a negative confession, which is where he would have to pronounce 42 sins that he did not commit. Now, the number 42 stays pretty consistent throughout, but the sins that they would commit, say that they did not commit, I will. Would you please mute your microphones? Let's see here. I don't know what's happening there. Okay. Let's see. If your microphone is unmuted, please mute. Okay. There it is. Okay, resolved. Sorry about that. Okay, now Titus Kennedy is an archaeologist who makes an interesting connection between the heavy heart in Egyptian mythology and Pharaoh making his heart heavy in the narrative in Exodus. That's interesting. But the number 42 is significant. Some texts would have that that's the number of body parts that were scattered from Osiris, but there's no real consistency there. But the list of sins would change from location to location because the actual negative confession itself is somewhat subjective. If you go further down, you see this bit where we see various body parts of Itanib being affiliated with various deities, trying to deify his body in an attempt to be accepted in the afterlife. Another part of the afterlife is seen in this text. So this is a bit broken off of cartonnage, perhaps from the bottom of a mask, kind of like this one. It's from the Manchester Museum. I did a translation and commentary of this text for Ariel magazine a few years ago that you can look up if you're interested. So what we're seeing here is the following. It's a offering, which you'll see in many texts. It says an offering which the king gives to Osiris, lord of Abydos. And then it says, may he give a voice offering of bread, beer, oxen, fowl, alabaster, linen, incense, and ointment, provisions, and everything good and pure upon which a god lives. For the Ka is a part of the soul that is in Egyptian mythology. It's not to find its legitimacy in the Bible. And then there's a big blank because this was mass produced, and then someone presumably would buy it and put his own name in there. So what we're seeing here is part of the ritual, wherein after a person dies, he would make, or while he was living, presumably he would collect bread, beer, oxen, fowl, all these goodies. And then upon death, he would make that as an offering to the gods to satisfy the gods. And then whatever the gods had left over would be his for the afterlife. And if you don't have enough goodies, or if you don't have enough negative confessions, then this goddess, Amit, who is part crocodile, part hippopotamus, and part lion, she would devour you. So we're seeing a lot of composite beings. We're seeing gods unable to fend for themselves. They need our sacrifices. This is what happens when you have an ontology that is based on the Egyptian myths. All right, so what are we seeing in all of this? We're seeing gods who are in no position to say what's right or wrong. We're seeing a deification of man. We're seeing a deification of nature. We're seeing sexual perversion. We're seeing sexual perversion in the religion. We're seeing sexual perversion in the politics. We're seeing real class oppression, not what the Marxists are crying about. We're seeing that only the rich can have an afterlife. The rest are doomed not to be able to feed the gods. We're seeing subjective standards of righteousness. The negative confessions change from person to person. This is because the Egyptian believed in many gods, none of whom were ontologically distinct, all of which come from the initial sneeze. We're all wrapped up in a cosmological battle of order versus chaos. There's no real good or evil, only chaos and an attempt to reorder things. That is not ethical monotheism. So whenever we look at the way things are and the way things ought to be from this worldview, the way things are, everything is boogers. And then the way things ought to be, we end up with a morally subjective polytheism. By the way, I don't think that the pagans are the only ones that are doing something similar here. Neil deGrasse Tyson has written an interesting essay saying every one of our body's atoms is traceable to the Big Bang and to the thermonuclear furnace with high mass stars. We are not simply in the universe, we are part of it. And we are part of it in a way that is separate with no existence of God. So there's a similar continuity of being. So that they're not saying that everything is boogers. In that worldview, everything is the universe. We're all star stuff, but we end up with something very similar. Instead of morally subjective polytheism, we end up with morally subjective atheism. Now, Robert Erlewine is an ethical monotheist who makes an interesting criticism of Christianity. He says that Judaism is the religion of ethical seriousness. As a corollary of this view of Judaism, Christianity, which is presented as pagan or partly pagan, is associated with immanent notions of the divine and romantic celebration of mythical and the irrational and is considered ethically suspect. So, he is saying that Christianity is ethically suspect for being too close to the paganistic worldview. Two things. First, I think that a lot of what he's saying here about Christianity and paganism likely comes from a misunderstanding of the doctrine of the Trinity. Second, there is indeed a legitimate history of anti-Semitism in the name of Jesus. But I think that literal grammatical historical hermeneutics can help us out here. There is reason to say that Christianity is ethically suspect because there are people in the names of Jesus who are doing things that are unethical. So it is important that we're able to express well the doctrine of the Trinity. This is a difficult task. But this is also a task that ecumenically we should all be on board on. Let's zoom in on some alternatives to dispensationalism that could perhaps put off a non-ethical monotheism vibe. The first one would be the Roman Catholic two-sword doctrine, in which the Pope would appoint the emperor, positioning the church above the state. That is a Roman Catholic view of the government that we see, for example, in the life of Charlemagne. But this also opens the door for a lot of genocidal acts that have been carried out in the name of the Roman Catholic Church. A lot of anti-Semitism has occurred, which would make Christianity look quite ethically suspect, if indeed this is what the New Testament is instructing us to do. Another way about it is Eastern Orthodox's doctrine of symphonia, which doesn't put the church over the state, but rather puts the church side by side with the state so that they co-rule together. Of course, that comes with problems. For example, we see here the wedding of False Dmitri in Moscow back in 1606, when the church appointed a fake ruler, someone posing as the appropriate ruler, as the head of the state. So that falls into a lot of realm of corruption, which we're currently seeing, especially with the Russian Orthodox Church. In Protestant expressions, we have problems, for example, with postmillennialism, which we see in the words of Benjamin Morgan Palmer. Now, he lived in the 19th century, and in his vision of postmillennialism and the growing kingdom on earth, he glorifies this. What do we see today? The Indian is practically extinct. Instead of the war whoop of the Indian, we hear the chimes of Sabbath bells and songs of praise issuing from myriads of Christian homes to the glory of God, who hath prepared his throne in heaven and whose kingdom ruleth over all. So in Palmer's worldview, the kingdom is growing, and part of that is the extermination, the genocide of Native Americans. Now, he says a lot about the genocide of Native Americans. He makes no mention of reaching them for Christ. He was also, by the way, a leading defender of American slavery. Kenneth Pearce has written a dissertation at the University of Edinburgh, if you want to read more about Palmer. In later years, Abraham Kuyper kind of comes to the main scene in the Netherlands. He converted to Calvinist orthodoxy and joined the Dutch anti-revolutionary movement. No background in conservative exegesis, but he invented a concept called sphere sovereignty, which arbitrarily looks around the world and sees various spheres developing and saying that God is the ruler of them all. which sounds pious, but what does it mean? It's difficult to tell. In fact, the people that followed Kuiper in generations to follow included Henrik Verwoerd, who used the sphere sovereignty model to justify apartheid in South Africa. Of course, in South Africa, we also have Alan Boesak, who uses Abraham's sphere sovereignty model to develop a Black liberation theology, which is in quite contrast to apartheid. So there's a lot of subjectiveness here that we're seeing, similar to the subjectivity that we saw with the Egyptian myths, but with a very Christian flavor to it. In more recent times, especially in the United States, we see the rise of R.J. Rushdoony, who is an influential Reconstructionist, who had a vision of a day when America would be a Christian country and any practicing Hindu would be executed. More recently, we have Paula White rising to the scene with the Seven Mountain Mandate, which is a purported message from God delivered to evangelicals to Lauren Cunningham and Bill Bright and Francis Schaeffer. There was an additional revelation allegedly given in 1975, which says there are 7 mountains in society. They are family, religion, education, media, entertainment, business, and government. And the church is now on a mission to conquer these 7 hills. You will not find this in the Bible. It is based on an inaugurated eschatology and an additional revelation. So let's visit these Christian ideologies in terms of the way things are and the way things ought to be. Well, what we're seeing from these thinkers is that the way things ought to be sounds like a very unethical monotheism. We're seeing acts of anti-Semitism. We're seeing genocides of the Native American populations. We're seeing apartheid. We're seeing declarations that we should execute practicing Hindus and so forth. But what is the basis of this? What are they saying the way things are? Well, they're not saying that everything is the universe or everything is boogers. But the way that they're acting would make you wonder that they're kind of drifting in that direction. I would propose to you that they are having a faulty epistemological and metaphysical foundation. I would say that our Jewish friends are correct, that there are indeed unethical applications of Christianity. Our Jewish friends are also correct that these unethical applications come from faulty views of God. However, our Jewish friends are incorrect that this comes from an inherently faulty view of the God of the Greek scriptures. And this, I think, is where ethical dispensationalism can come into the play. So currently we have the model of all the guys that we looked at before. I think that the epistemological and metaphysical foundation comes from an inaugurated eschatology. Now, inaugurated eschatology has its own epistemology and metaphysics that I think has gone astray. The Bible, in this view, is spiritualized. And I think Herman Cohen's critique of Christianity following Philo that we saw earlier comes into play here. Because if we look at the spiritualized hermeneutic, a lot of that traces all the way back to Philo of Alexandria, whom he critiqued earlier, who was a Hellenist that was informed by Greek paganism, as well as the Egyptian paganism and the syncretism of Greek and Egyptian paganism of his day. This was carried over into Christendom to the heretic Origen of Alexandria, who had a great influence on Augustine of Hippo, who ultimately influenced the reformers, and we're still seeing that epistemology today. Whenever we take this approach to the Bible, we end up with a view of scriptures that says that the author of scriptures wrote in a way that is not plain to see, that we must seek another way of understanding him. The doctrine of perspicuity is relevant here. Our friends in rabbinic Judaism reject perspicuity, saying that we need the rabbis to tell us what the Bible says. Our friends in Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy reject perspicuity, saying that we need the church fathers to tell us what the Bible says. Our Reformed friends are not so extreme. They do, however, compromise on perspicuity by restricting the content that is clear to the gospel and by restricting the audience to which it is clear to be only the elect. but they still would end up with a view that we cannot understand what the author of Scripture has said. And so, because of this epistemology, I think they've ended up with a different metaphysics in which God becomes a booger, very much like what we saw in the Egyptian myths from which a lot of this comes. Now, it may be a little bit of an overstatement to say that the God of dominion theology is a booger. Okay, that might be an overstatement, but I don't think it's an overstatement to say that they give the author of scriptures a runny nose, at least by following the hermeneutics that ultimately trace back to a pagan basis. So, I would propose the following. As dispensationalists, we can do away with inaugurated eschatology by reading the Bible plainly. As such, we would see the kingdom as entirely future. Instead, we can stick strictly to the Bible and the perspicuous reading of it, the clear reading of it. The idea that we can accept the Bible for what it says at face value, and that we can understand the Bible because God wrote it in a way that is clear for us to understand. I am currently doing some doctoral work on societal units that we can derive from the Bible. They are the individual, the family, and the country. That's a huge topic, perhaps for another day. But if we begin with this as our basis, then we can derive a politics and an ethics that comes from the Bible rather than from a theology of inaugurated eschatology. Instead of allowing our a weird eschatology to drive us to do what we need to do, granted, eschatology does inform us on our day-to-day living, we can use biblical realities, the individual, the family, the country, what the Bible says about the design for society, as our basis for politics and ethics. One result, of course, is our stance against anti-Semitism, whereas a lot of Christian anti-Semitism always goes back to a replacement theology for a kingdom now eschatology. However, we can also derive certain dispensationalist activisms in other ways. Because we understand God's reality, his design for society, we can have an optimism that we can have a nice society now, even if we know that eventually things are going to get bad in the future tribulation period before they get worse or get better in the messianic kingdom. Okay, so that is the proposal. So we've talked about ethical monotheism and where that school of thought comes from. We've looked at some alternatives. We've looked at Egyptian myths. You could probably do the same with several other ancient Near Eastern and other pagan religions. We looked at the way that unethical Christian Trinitarianism has come to be. And we've discussed how an ethical dispensationalism can get out of that rut and move forward to a way that is truly ethically monotheistic. All right, so any questions, comments, great ideas, details, haiku poetry, rude remarks, recipes?
Paul,
Yes, sir.
I just sent you, you can see the three pictures that I showing you guys is basically how the philosophy haven't changed to the years, and it's coming up into movies in Hollywood. For instance, maybe you heard the movie The Avengers. They're fighting for those gloves, for that glove with gems. And the story of the gem is related to at the beginning of the universe, there was this creature named Nemesis. Nemesis lived alone. Since he lived alone, he decided to kill himself. But by killing himself, part of the gems are part of the universe. And so basically, it's nothing new under the sun. You have another entity who's called itself Infinity, and it's composed of a human being corpse and part of the universe, just like the Egyptians. So just to show you that nothing new under the sun. It's just under another name, another label, but it's the same thing. We're part of the universe and we're all linked together.
Yeah, so that's kind of how a lot of mythology works. Thanks for bringing in the contemporary stuff, right? I don't think that Avengers is just out there for entertainment, right? It actually has a lot of morals that it's trying to teach. Now, granted, nobody is going to X-Men or the comic books to figure out our origins, but it often presupposes this evolutionary concept uh, that is fundamentally atheistic, and it uses that kind of a story to tell us what's right and wrong. A difference with this and what we see in the polytheism is that there is in polytheism there is also a creation narrative that is intimately linked. So that's very interesting. There's also an interesting school of thought that whenever we hear about the mighty men of old, whom you've heard about even today, whenever we read the Genesis narratives. There's a thought that a lot of mythology has its roots in paganistic ideas. Some would say that a lot of that the fallen angels have served as the basis for a lot of paganistic text. There are some directions that people can go with that I would advise caution with. I don't think it's necessarily true that all of the pagan gods are real, that they're created fallen angels. But I don't see that as necessarily heretical either. Um, Philip Yonda made an allusion to uh, Heiser's book, The Unseen Realm. Could you describe what's going on there, Philip?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, you were talking about the code of Hammurabi, and it reminded me about how, like, I don't know, I'm not like an expert in in these things, but I felt like when I was reading or listening to Heiser's book that he was sort of just carrying over things that were similar enough in like tone or content from ancient Near East sources, and like, all right, that sounds like what's going on in the Bible. So then he kind of just is like, all right, so they borrowed from that, but then it puts the reader in a position where they're like, well, we have to understand ancient Near East, um, like theology and religion, really, to like understand the Bible. Like it kind of gatekeeps the Bible, you know. Um, which it's kind of like off topic from what you're talking about, but it just made me
Yeah.
think about that because I think when you do a deep dive into these things, they might be alike, but they're not alike enough for us to just be like, you know, completely draw into. Like there's no doubt that like we all know like the Mosaic law, for example, is similar in kind to other covenants, but it's not necessarily one for one. Like it's unique in its own way, you know, partly because of just how who and how God is. So I hope that answers your question. Or, you know, explains
Absolutely.
my comment more than, you know.
I'm in agreement with you. Um, I had Heiser as a professor when I was doing my master's, and we bumped heads on a lot of things. He kind of used it as a platform to try to talk students out of dispensationalism. His first assignment was describe what you see happening in the temple at the end of Ezekiel, and I took the dispensationalist view, and he just blew up, you know. And, that book, The Unseen Realm, has had a huge impact. Heiser was the resident theologian at Logos, which is a position that if you have something like that, you're able to really promote your own books to a lot of pastors because a lot of people use Logos. I was introduced to the book by a friend who read it and found it disturbing. And as I went through Heiser's book there, I saw some really concerning things. Some of the stuff that you're talking about, Phil, with kind of assuming that to read the Bible, you have to understand uh, the ancient Near Eastern religions. On top of that, he made the statement in his book that the Bible, the biblical authors, shared the worldview of their pagan neighbors, which I find incredibly disturbing. um, Now, there are points where Israel falls into polytheism, but those narratives always position Israel as sinning at that point. Never does the Bible say we should turn to those as the proper basis for cosmology or theology in any sense. In fact, it was Heiser's book and his absolute, in my opinion, mistreatment of the Bible using ancient Near Eastern texts. That's what ultimately drove me to study Egyptian hieroglyphs at Manchester. I was hoping to take my dissertation in a direction that would actually take that head on. But then with the escalation of the genocide of Ukrainians as part of Russia's struggle against the West with its Russian Orthodox relations there, I decided to go in a different direction to address some more geopolitical needs. So there's a lot of stuff that needs to be criticized in Heiser's writing, and I'm seeing a lot of it just passing in evangelical, even really conservative evangelical circles.
Hey, Paul, it's interesting as you connect the dots from the far past into the current future and current times that we live in, how you can actually see how postmodernism is birthed out of that. And I think, as you said, with especially American conservatism, especially the move into the woke right, as it's been called,
Yeah.
has you can kind of see how these dots are connecting and progressing in a very disturbing way. And so the question is that, do you kind of see it going that same way? Do you see it maybe perhaps moving towards more tolerance? Maybe moving towards more of a universalism, more towards a one world religion, even?
Good question. I'm seeing a lot of things go in a lot of different directions. We're living in crazy times right now. It's a time of groupthink, but also a time of extreme individualism. Uh, Everybody has a voice on the internet and social media, and so now everybody is regarded an expert. The validity of an idea is not based on its actual validity, but based on how many shares it gets, right? Because of that, we're seeing a lot of contention happening, complicated by the fact that everybody feels like a superhero whenever he's hiding behind his laptop or his phone. So trolls are taking ideas that would have been fringe a generation ago and making it a lot more norm, a lot more acceptable. So it's not that we're all going in the same direction. We're all going in different directions, but those different directions are somewhat limited uh, in their scope because we're still getting into to group think, if you will. That's how we end up with the woke right. For those that are unfamiliar with the woke right, those are kind of the guys that are just building a worldview as a response to the left. Because Putin presents himself as opposing the left, he must be the good guy because the left is obviously the bad guy. In reality, the left and Putin have a lot more in common with each other than they do anything else, the Bible especially. So we're seeing a lot of that. I think that moving forward, we're going to have to not so much reevaluate the dispensational frameworks that previous generations have built on. It's not that our theological forefathers have done a bad job of building frameworks, but I'm of the conviction that we, the 21st century dispensationalists, really need to address the question of worldview and frameworks in a way that is holistic, not just answering the problems of the past, but moving forward. Uh, Postmodernism, for example, was a buzzword in the 20th century. Prior to that, we had modernism, which says we can discern truth because there is no God. And so long as we use purely naturalistic means, we can figure out everything that is true, right? So the question of what is true was answered incorrectly, which led to the question, what is truth? My truth is my truth, your truth is your truth. That's the postmodern way. And postmodernism answered that question incorrectly. A lot of Christians were still hung up on the question of what is true while that was going on. So I don't think the postmodern question was necessarily answered very well from a dispensationalist perspective every time. But whenever you get the first question, what is true, wrong, the next question is what is truth. When you get that question wrong, the next question is what we are facing today. And the more I look around the world today, the more it seems to me that the predominant question in our culture is no longer what is true. It is no longer what is truth. The question now is, how do I make it through this week without putting a gun in my mouth? We have become, just as a culture, very depressed. We're seeing a lot of really dark humor coming out of various social influencers. This could just be because of my veteran background, seeing the veteran community dealing with an absolute epidemic of suicide. But I tend to think that we've gotten so many questions wrong as a society that we've gotten to a point where it's completely changing the questions. I think that the former apologetics of proving the existence of God has not necessarily become unimportant, but I think that the future of apologetics is going to be in the sphere of psychological apologetics, by showing people that, hey, Christianity is the worldview of maturity. Christianity explains why you are broken. Christianity is the worldview that can help you think right so that you're no longer dealing with the psychological problems that you're dealing with. That's a long and drawn out interaction there. I think that's the direction that we're probably moving. More towards psychological problems that the world is not answering, and we dispensationalists need to be answering them with a better framework.
Yeah, that's very good. I appreciate that, and especially talking about the foundations. A move towards a framework. I think it's very important. So very interesting. Thank you very much, Paul.
Yeah, thank you. Framework is a word I like. Worldview is a cool term, but the more I look around, it doesn't seem that our secular counterparts are using worldview verbiage as much as we in Christianity are. It's good verbiage, but it can very easily become a shibboleth. It can be a technical term that you have to be a Christian already to understand. And then we start going down a sort of a presuppositional hermeneutic path that can go funky on you.
Along the lines of worldview, Paul, I've heard you a couple of times with your categories there, and just to kind of clarify in my own mind, I like to separate out theology. In other words, a person in terms of the elements of a worldview, and actually capitalize on one's view of God, because that seems to, in my mind at least, determines everything else, is one's view of God. So that would be a major element of a worldview. I was just curious. I know your metaphysics includes that, but I like to even separate it out of metaphysics.
That's a very good point. I'm trying to revise the four-layered cake model. I'm still working on it. As you could see early in the presentation, it's still a little bit messy. Where does aesthetics sit in it? It seems that there should be a model of some sort that we can put everybody on, right? There's still the question, right? We're dealing with the question of who is God? What kind of God is he? How does that influence the design of the world, the layout of the universe? How does that influence ultimately ethics, social political thought, and aesthetics? Even if you reject God, you're still asking the same questions.
That is the view of God, though. That is a particular view of God.
The non-existence of God is a view of God, right? So I'm open to any suggestions on how to revise the cake model, the 4-layer cake model, in a way that it allows for more interaction between epistemology and metaphysics. I swear, if I put epistemology on the top and metaphysics on the bottom, people complain. If I put metaphysics on the top and epistemology on the bottom, I get people complain. I got a phone call because I didn't have aesthetics in my cake one time. So I'm trying to think. I don't know. Maybe a pyramid would be better. It's a thing that's happening in my brain these days.
I just like to separate God because in my mind, it determines everything else. One's view of God determines virtually everything else, ethics, everything else, epistemology, everything else.
Oh, Peter has something interesting. He says in the UK, the amillennial and postmillennial churches are attracting younger people because they offer young people the revolutionary cause found in communism, socialism, which so easily excites young people. It emphasizes the clash between order and chaos. Would you like to expound on that, Peter?
Yeah, sure. So it's just something I've noticed. I think young people, we love a cause when we're younger, don't we? And we like binary situations, and we see this in the left, and obviously, as you said, with the right, identity politics almost adopting the same thing. And the amillennial, postmillennial, the inaugural theology that you mentioned, the reform theology, building the kingdom, I think just inherently, it kind of connects with that attribute in younger people. Naturally, connects naturally with them a lot more than the dispensational view, because I think the dispensational view almost comes across in that kind of doomsday apocalyptic sense, almost like the extreme green movement where we're all doomed. And I think young people can find that uncomfortable, because young people tend to want to get married, have children, have lives. And within our church, we literally have seen younger people, when they get married, they will then gravitate off to reformed churches, amillennial, postmillennial churches, to bring their children up in, because they feel more comfortable with that.
That's interesting. And I agree, this is a problem we can get into if we allow dispensationalism to be an eschatology of doom and gloom rather than a worldview, right? So that's something that needs to be developed in our circles, right? A dispensational cause, if you will. We've always had evangelism front and center. George Eldon Laud, one of the biggest critics of dispensationalism in the 20th century, recognized dispensationalists as some of the greatest evangelists. I think, though, that there's a kind of a spirit of the age of how do we relate to society. We're seeing that in wokeism. So a lot of amil and postmills are able to build on the woke machine. Then you have dominionism, the postmill, which is only reactive, as far as I can tell, in its most common expressions. Reactive against dispensationalism, reactive against wokeism. So you get the woke right, pro-Putin, that kind of thing. I think as dispensationalists, we could build a framework that actually deals with that. My current work on the individual, the society, or the individual, the family, and the country, as God's design for society, I think could hold a lot of punch that could give a lot of anxious young people what they're looking for, right? The individual, conquer yourself, right? Show self-discipline before you try to take on society. That's powerful. That's something to build a movement on. The family, right? Raise up your family right. If you're young and a single man, seek out a woman who loves the Lord. If you're a young single woman, seek out a man who loves the Lord. If you're trying to get married, don't fall into this nonsense about the hookup culture, right? Then we can start criticizing political theories on the basis of the country. We should be getting away from the tendency toward multipolarity that we're seeing in the left, that we're seeing in the Russian political ideology. There's so much there that we could be building a movement around. And if we just have prophecy conferences all the time. As important as prophecy is, you can't overteach prophecy, but you can underteach other things. I think we got a lot of potential to offer that a much better version of that, which is attracting the young people.
Well, premillennialism isn't gloom and doom. It's actually resolution to the problem of evil, and it's positive. I mean, there's a good ending, not a gloom and doom ending.
Very much so, right? Jesus being glorious and establishing a kingdom on earth, as opposed to the alleged kingdom that we have around here. If this is the kingdom, we're in serious trouble. This is the Triashina part of the kingdom, as we might say in Kiev. Also interesting because one text that people will go to in order to say that, oh, everything is just getting worse, would be the apostasy comes first and then the revolution of the Antichrist. However, that particular passage there in 2 Thessalonians 2, there's been a lot of debates recently that perhaps that is not a reference to a spiritual apostasy of the church, but rather a physical departure of the church, which is interesting. That could push us to kind of alter a couple of aspects of our eschatology. David Knight mentions the worship of music that has infiltrated the church through the likes of Bethel, etc. That's where aesthetics comes into play, right? Oh my goodness. Jan, show us the Faroe Islands.
Well, I was just waiting for you to stop talking.
Beautiful.
Well, I'm standing up here on a mountain road, looking down to a valley, to the fjords, and you can see some islands in the background. So,
wow.
I'm on vacation here with my wife right now. So, I just wanted to show you the scenery while you're online.
Oh, that is beautiful. I would love to go to the Faroe Islands sometime.
It's better than the UK, I promise you.
A little further north, right? Well, I think that's a great way to wrap it up today with a view of the Faroe Islands. So, again, I'm Paul Miles, and this has been an ISBH presentation as part of our series on Israel and the Church. And we've been talking about ethical monotheism and how to reframe it with a dispensational framework. Thank you for tuning in.